Adaeze had buried her mother 7 months ago. She had chosen the casket herself. Polished mahogany with brass handles, 45,000 naira, because her mother, Mama Chidinma, had always said that the way a woman left this earth said everything about the life she had lived. Adaeze had wept until her chest felt hollow, until her eyes were swollen shut and her voice had gone raw and strange. She had washed and folded her mother's wrappers, packed away the bottles of palm kernel oil Mama kept on the kitchen windowsill, and learned slowly and painfully how to walk into a compound that no longer smelled of egusi soup and firewood smoke. She had told herself the hardest part was behind her. She was wrong. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Texas, Georgia, maybe London or Lagos. We want to know. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when Adaeze's world collapsed for the second time. She was moving through the crowded lanes of Oyingbo market in Lagos, her basket hooked over one arm, her mind elsewhere, running through the list of things she needed. Tomatoes, crayfish, a bunch of uziza leaves, the kind her mother had always insisted on buying fresh and never frozen. She had kept the habit even after the funeral, buying uziza every Saturday the way Mama had taught her, even though she now cooked for one. She was reaching past a pyramid of onions toward a tray of peppers when she saw her. There, 3 stalls ahead, moving unhurriedly through the press of Saturday shoppers with a blue Ankara wrapper tied firmly at her waist and a basket balanced on her forearm, was a woman who walked exactly like Mama Chidinma. Not similar. Exactly. The same slight forward lean. The same measured, deliberate step, the left foot landing a fraction heavier than the right, the result of an old ankle injury from 1987 that Mama had complained about every rainy season for as long as Adaeze could remember. The same way of tilting her head to examine produce, chin slightly down, eyes slightly narrowed, as if the tomatoes had personally offended her and she was giving them one final chance to explain themselves. Adaeze's basket slipped from her arm. It hit the ground and the peppers she had been holding scattered across the wet concrete, and a market woman nearby said something sharp about careless customers, but Adaeze did not hear her. Her legs had already begun moving, pushing through the crowd with an urgency she hadn't felt in her body since the morning she had received the phone call 9 months ago telling her that her mother was gone. "Mama?" she called out. Her own voice frightened her. It came out torn and strange, the voice of a woman who had been holding something down for 9 months and felt it suddenly rise beyond her control. The woman ahead stopped. She turned slowly, the way people turn in markets when they are not sure whether a voice is meant for them. And when her face came into full view, Adaeze felt the ground shift beneath her feet as though the concrete of Oyingbo market had become something soft and unreliable. It was her mother. Every detail Adaeze had spent 34 years memorizing was present and unchanged. The broad, smooth forehead that had never quite lined the way other women's foreheads lined. The gap between the 2 front teeth that Mama had always called her God-given trademark. The small raised keloid scar just above her right eyebrow, earned when a cooking pot fell from a shelf in 1993 and Adaeze, 7 years old, had screamed so loudly the neighbors came running. The deep brown eyes that had a habit of seeing through things, through excuses, through performances, through every small dishonesty a daughter tried to hide. Those eyes were looking at Adaeze now. And in them, for one single, suspended moment, something moved. Something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like recognition. Then it was gone. The woman's face settled into the polite, slightly cautious expression of a stranger who has been called by the wrong name in a public place. Her voice, when it came, was that same low warm voice that had sung Adaeze to sleep and prayed over her and scolded her and praised her across 3.5 decades, and yet the words it carried made no sense at all. She was sorry, the woman said gently. She thought Adaeze was mistaking her for someone else. Adaeze's hands were shaking as she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a photograph. Her mother at her last birthday, sitting in the plastic chair in the compound in Enugu, wearing the yellow lace blouse Adaeze had bought her, smiling the specific smile she reserved for photographs, lips pressed together, eyes bright, slightly reluctant, as if happiness were something a sensible woman did not display too freely. She held the phone up. The woman looked at the photograph. And again that flicker. Brief and devastating and gone before it could be caught and named. Then her face settled back into careful, patient blankness, and she shook her head with a quiet, unhurried certainty. Her name was Mrs. Ngozi Okafor, she said. She had never seen that photograph. She placed a brief, careful hand on Adaeze's shoulder, The same hand, the same warm dry palm that had rested on Adaeze's forehead during every childhood fever, and suggested gently that Adaeze sit somewhere and drink water. Grief, she said, did terrible things to the mind. Ngozi Okafor. Adaeze stared at her. She let her eyes travel. The blue Ankara wrapper. The plain flat sandals. The small silver stud earrings, not the gold ones Mama always wore, not the pair Adaeze had given her for her 60th birthday. Different earrings. Different wrapper. But the face. The face was her mother's face in every possible way that a face could be another face. Your hand, Adaeze said suddenly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Show me your left hand. The woman frowned, uncertain, but she raised her hand the way people raise their hands when they are humoring someone they feel sorry for. And there it was. The thumb. Slightly flattened at the tip, the nail growing at a small inward angle, the result of a grinding stone that had slipped when Adaeze was 12 years old and Mama had cried out and Adaeze had run from the next room and found her sitting on the kitchen floor holding her hand and laughing through the pain saying, "This stone has been fighting me for 20 years, today it finally won." The same thumb. Identical. The woman lowered her hand and stepped back quietly, the movement of someone who has decided the conversation is finished. She was truly sorry, she said, for whatever Adaeze was going through. She hoped she would feel better soon. Then she turned her basket toward the next aisle and moved away through the crowd, and Adaeze stood in the middle of Oyingbo market while the Saturday noise crashed around her and a child brushed past her leg, and somewhere nearby a trader was announcing the price of stockfish at the top of his voice. She knew she should leave. She knew she should call her brother Emeka or her friend Blessing or anyone who could sit with her and calmly explain that grief was a powerful and disorienting thing and that the mind under the weight of loss could produce experiences that felt entirely real. But the voice inside her, the one she had inherited from her mother along with the stubbornness and the inability to leave a wrong thing unexamined, was not speaking calmly. It was screaming. So Adaeze followed her. She kept her distance, moving through the stalls as though she had a purpose, pausing to examine things she had no intention of buying. She watched the woman pay for a bundle of stockfish and 2 tubers of yam, paying in cash, no hesitation, with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew this market well. She watched her load her purchases into a larger basket she had left with a young girl at the entrance, a girl of perhaps 14 who called her auntie and received the basket without being asked. Adaeze watched them walk out of the market together and into the bright late morning heat of the street outside. She watched them get into a white Sienna bus, the old kind with the sliding door, parked in the shade of a neem tree a short distance from the market entrance. She memorized the plate number. ABJ 742 Co. Then she went to her own car, the small Hyundai her mother had prayed over when Adaeze bought it 3 years ago, standing in the compound in Enugu with her palms raised and her eyes closed, asking God to keep this vehicle and the woman inside it from all harm, and she followed the white bus. Her hands on the steering wheel were not steady. They drove away from the market, through streets that grew gradually quieter as the city's noise fell behind them, through a neighborhood of solid bungalows behind low fences, past a church Adaeze had never noticed before with a blue gate and a signboard that had faded in the sun. The white Sienna turned twice, first left, then right into a narrow street lined with mango trees old enough that their roots had begun pushing up through the tarmac. It stopped in front of a house painted the color of ripe pawpaw. Orange-yellow, warm and deliberate, with a low white fence and a small garden where something green and carefully tended grew along the inside of the wall. The kind of house that had been lived in long enough to develop a settled, unhurried quality. The kind of house that asked nothing of the street and expected nothing in return. The woman got out with her basket. The girl carried the yam. The front door opened before they reached the gate. A man appeared. Tall, perhaps 60, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now simply distinguished. He was wearing a plain white kaftan and he smiled when he saw the woman. Not the careful smile of someone performing happiness for an audience, but the private, involuntary smile of a man who has spent a long time loving something and has never fully gotten over the fact of it. He took the basket from her hands. She said something to him that Adaeze could not hear from the street and he laughed. And then from inside the house came the sound of children, 2 of them from the sound of it, and a moment later they came tumbling out of the front door and down the short path, and the woman opened her arms and received them both at once. A boy and a girl, small enough that they disappeared into her embrace, and she bent her head over them and held them the way Adaeze's mother had held Adaeze every time she came home from university, as though the child had been gone too long in the holding. needed to make up for the absence. Adaeze sat in her car 50 meters away. She did not realize she was crying until she felt the wetness on her jaw. 9 months of mourning. 9 months of learning to wake up in a world that did not contain her mother. 9 months of carrying the grief the way you carry something precious and broken, carefully, constantly, afraid of what will happen if you put it down. And her mother was here. Alive. In a pawpaw yellow house on a mango tree street in Lagos, holding children who were not Adaeze, held by a man Adaeze had never seen, living a life that Adaeze had never been shown. With hands that trembled so badly she had to hold the phone with both of them, Adaeze photographed everything. The house. The white bus. The plate number. The woman through the open gate. Several pictures came out blurred and useless. Several were clear enough. When the gate closed and the street was quiet again, Adaeze started her engine. She did not remember the drive home. She came back to herself sitting in the parking space outside her flat in Lekki, staring at the photographs on her phone, holding them against the pictures of her mother she had kept, comparing them with the slow, exhausted attention of a woman who already knew what she was looking at but needed to be certain. The scar above the right eyebrow. Present in both. The gap between the front teeth, visible in a photograph from 5 years ago where Mama was laughing openly at something Emeka had said. Visible again today in the fraction of a second the woman had smiled at the girl with the basket. The thumb. The flattened tip. The inward growing nail. Everything identical. Everything her mother. Adaeze went inside and sat down in her living room without turning on the lights. And in the growing afternoon quiet of the flat, a question arrived with the force and precision of something that has been gathering for a long time and can no longer be contained. If Mama is alive, then who did they bury? She did not sleep that night. At the small dining table she used as a desk, under the lamp she left on when she could not sleep, Adaeze laid out every photograph she owned. Her mother at 40, standing in the compound in Enugu with the pride of a woman who has just finished building her own house. Mama at 50, wearing the gold head tie Adaeze had bought from a trader in ABA. Mama at 60 at the birthday party in the yellow lace blouse, laughing despite herself at the camera. She took out her reading glasses and examined each image with the same careful attention she gave to legal documents in her work as a paralegal. And beside each photograph on the screen of her phone were the pictures from that morning. The market. The pawpaw yellow house. The woman with the blue Ankara wrapper and the stockfish and the children who ran to her like she was the safest thing in the world. The results were the same every time. The clock on the wall read 2:45 when Adaeze set her glasses down and pressed both palms flat against the table. Outside, Lagos was its restless nighttime self, generators humming behind walls, a motorcycle somewhere distant, the city that never fully went to sleep. Her tea had gone cold. Her phone was at 11% battery and she had not noticed. She began, with the deliberate clarity of a woman who understands that the alternative to clarity is a kind of madness she cannot afford, to think back through everything she knew. The phone call had come on a Tuesday morning 9 months ago. Her uncle, Mama's younger brother, Uncle Sixtus, calling from Enugu. There had been an accident. A bus. The Enugu-Onitsha road, early morning. Mama had been coming back from a vigil at the parish. The bus had veered. There were no survivors from the front section where Mama had been seated. The casket had been closed. Uncle Sixtus had said it was better that way. That the family should remember her as she was. Adaeze had accepted this. She had been too deep in grief to question it. Emeka had accepted it. The relatives had accepted it. The church women who had wailed and the neighbors who had brought food and the priest who had spoken kindly at the graveside had all accepted it. A closed casket. No one had seen the body. Adaeze sat with this knowledge in the small hours of the Lagos morning and felt it rearrange everything she thought she had known. When the first gray light came through the curtains, she picked up her phone and called her brother. Emeka answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep. He was in Abuja, where he worked for a government ministry, and the time difference in his schedule meant he slept later than Adaeze. When she told him she needed him in Lagos that same day, he pushed back immediately, something about a 10 o'clock meeting. She did not raise her voice. She simply used the tone she had not reached for since childhood, the one their mother used, quiet and certain and entirely without room for negotiation, and told him it was about Mama. The silence that followed stretched long enough that she could hear him sitting up in his bed. Then, without another word of protest, he said he would take the morning flight. Emeka arrived at 12:30 looking like a man who had been unsettled before he even boarded the plane. He was wearing his work clothes, a pale blue shirt and dark trousers, as if he had not quite decided whether this visit was personal or official and had dressed for the ambiguity. He came into the flat and looked at his sister across the room, and something in his face shifted at the sight of her, the shadows under her eyes, the way she was sitting at the table, very still, with both hands around a cup of tea she was not drinking. Without waiting for him to speak, Adaeze told him to sit down. She walked him through everything quietly, in order, without rushing. The market. The woman with the gap-toothed smile and the deliberate step and the ruined thumb. The white sienna bus. The pawpaw yellow house. The man in the white kaftan who smiled like a husband. The children who ran like grandchildren. She laid the photographs on the table as she spoke, arranging them beside the old pictures from the albums she had been up all night with, and she watched her brother's face as each image landed. Emeka was a man who processed things slowly and thoroughly. He was not a man given to quick reactions or surface emotions. He had cried once at the funeral, quietly with his head bowed, and then he had composed himself and organized the catering and made sure the relatives had places to sleep and managed the logistics of grief with the quiet efficiency that was his particular strength. He looked at the photographs for a long time. Too long. A man who was genuinely hearing impossible news for the first time would have moved by now. Would have reached for an explanation the way a person reaches for a switch in a dark room. Emeka was not reaching for anything. He was very, very still. And his stillness had a quality that Adaeze recognized, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a man who is trying to decide how much to say. When she told him she wanted to go to the street right then that morning so he could see the house for himself, something moved across his face, fast and controlled. He suggested she rest first. She had been awake all night, he said. Grief did strange things. She looked at him directly and told him she was not a woman who had lost her mind from grief. She was a woman who had found her mother alive in Lagos. Those were two very different things, and she needed him to treat them accordingly. Then she picked up her car keys and walked to the door, and he followed. They drove to the mango tree street in near silence. Adaeze parked under the same tree as the day before, engine off, 50 meters from the pawpaw yellow house. The morning was bright and the orange pink of the house walls was vivid in the full daylight. The white sienna was still there. A bougainvillea that Adaeze had not noticed the day before was flowering purple against the right side of the fence. They waited. 15 minutes. 20. Then the front door opened and the woman came out. She was wearing a different wrapper today, green and gold, and she had a small handbag over her shoulder. She moved down the path with the same deliberate, left-foot heavy step. She opened the gate herself. She paused at the gate and turned to say something back into the compound, and as she turned, her profile was fully visible in the clear morning light. Beside Adaeze, Emeka made a sound. It was a small sound. The kind that escapes without permission. The kind that comes out of a person when something hits a place they were not guarding. She turned to look at him. Emeka was staring through the windscreen at the woman now walking along the fence toward the road junction. His face had changed completely. The controlled, administrative composure was gone. What was underneath it was something younger and much more frightened. His hands, resting on his thighs, were pressed flat and hard against his trousers the way hands press when they are trying to stop themselves from shaking. And his eyes were full. She watched the tears build in her brother's eyes and understood something that hit her like a door swung open from the other side. This was not the face of a man seeing something impossible. This was the face of a man seeing something he already knew. His name left her lips quietly, just that, nothing more, and the single word carried everything it needed to carry. He shook his head. He could not speak. She told him to look at her and he turned and she saw the full weight of it on his face. The specific, devastating weight of something that has been carried in secret for a long time and has finally become too heavy to hold. You knew, she said. It was not a question. Emeka pressed one fist against his mouth. His shoulders came up. And then, quietly, without drama, he began to cry. Not the composed, bowed head grief of the funeral. Something rawer and more private than that. The tears of a man whose arms had finally given out. Adaeze sat beside him and waited. She waited until he could breathe steadily enough to speak. Then she told him to tell her everything. It came out of him slowly, the way things come out of a person who has been holding them so long that the holding has become part of who they are and the releasing feels like losing something, even when the thing being released has been destroying them from the inside with a patience and thoroughness that only deeply buried things can manage. He had known for 6 months. Not since the beginning. He was clear about this, insistent about it, in the way that guilty people are insistent about the precise boundaries of their guilt as though the precision makes it smaller. Mama had not told him everything at once. She had called him first 2 weeks after the funeral from a number he did not recognize. An Abuja number he had thought, perhaps a ministry contact. He had answered with the distracted efficiency of a man at his desk expecting professional correspondence. And he had heard his mother's voice. Emeka stopped speaking for a moment when he reached this part. He pressed his lips together and looked out of the windscreen at the pawpaw yellow house and the orange flowers and the quiet mango tree street, and Adaeze watched his jaw work with the effort of continuing. The first time he put the phone down. He heard her voice and ended the call and sat at his desk unable to move for 20 minutes. Then she called back. And she had given him time after that, been patient with the shock, waited through the long silences while he tried to make his breathing even enough to engage. It was so entirely like her, he said, that this was almost the most disorienting part. The voice was her voice. The patience was her patience. The particular quality of her silence, the kind that communicated she was present and waiting and not going anywhere, was her silence exactly. And then she had explained. Over 3 phone calls across the following 2 weeks, the picture had assembled itself piece by piece, each call adding another layer to what he was carrying. The first call had been about her safety, where she was, that she was well, that this had been a choice and not something done to her. The second had been about the life before Enugu, brief and incomplete, a sketch of a past he had never known existed. The third had been about what she needed from him. Not much, she had said. Only his silence. Only his willingness to let her be gone. Adaeze turned to look at her brother's profile. He was 38 years old and he looked, in this moment, considerably older than that, with the specific aging that comes not from years but from the weight of a thing carried too long in the wrong position. She asked him quietly whether she had asked him to actively lie to anyone. He shook his head. She had been very careful about that, he said. She was not asking him to say anything false. She was only asking him not to say what he knew. He had told himself for 6 months that those were 2 different things. Adaeze let the silence hold that admission for a moment before she asked whether they actually were. No, he said finally. No, they were not. She thought about the 9 months they had spent together in grief, calling each other on Sundays, visiting the grave, navigating the practical business of loss. The care he had shown her. Real care, she was certain of it. Not performed. He had genuinely wanted to help her through it. And he had known, through all of it, that there was nothing to get through. She reminded him quietly that he had cried at the funeral. That she had seen him, head bowed, crying. And that the funeral had come 2 weeks before that first phone call. He turned to look at her fully. The funeral was before she called, he said. He had not known yet when they stood at that graveside. But then she called, and he knew, and he watched his sister grieve for 6 more months anyway. For you, he said quietly, his voice barely holding its shape. He had been crying at the funeral for her. Because everything on her face was real and he had nothing he could do with it. This answer, she thought, was the truest thing he had said. She held it and turned it over and understood that it was simultaneously a real expression of love and an entirely insufficient defense, and that both of those things were true and neither canceled the other. She asked him why. Not what Mama had told him. What he had told himself. Why he had chosen not to come to her. A child on a bicycle had appeared at the far end of the road, pedaling carefully along the edge. They both watched the child for a moment without speaking, and then Emeka looked down at his hands and said that telling her meant explaining everything. The life before Enugu. The man in that house. Everything Mama had been carrying for 40 years that he did not know how to put in front of her. He had been afraid of what it would do to how she remembered their mother. She had loved her differently than he did, he said. Always. Completely, with nothing held back. He was afraid the truth would break something in her that could not be repaired. So he had decided she was too fragile to bear it, Adaeze said. He said it plainly without trying to soften it. He had decided he knew better than her what she could handle. Yes. The child on the bicycle reached the end of the street and turned the corner and disappeared. She was 34 years old, Adaeze said. She had lived alone in Lagos for 9 years. She navigated legal documents for a living. She had buried their father. She had helped him through his divorce. She had been handling difficult things since she was old enough to understand what a difficult thing was. and he had decided she was too fragile. Yes, he said. Just the one word. He did not try to explain it further or soften it. She respected him for that. Then she pointed out something else. That he had received businesses and the Enugu house as part of their father's estate. That Mama's disappearance had meant the estate was never contested. That nobody had questioned what went where because there was no living spouse to claim anything. A long silence filled the car. She said his name once. He said he knew. She asked if he had thought about that. His voice was barely audible when he answered. He had thought about it. He had told himself it was what Mama wanted and he had chosen to believe that because it was easier than the alternative. This, Adaeze thought, was the thing that would take the longest to process. Not the initial shock. Not even the 6 months of maintained silence. But this. The way a person who loves you can look at a situation that benefits them and find, very quickly and with genuine sincerity, a reason to believe it is also the right thing. She had seen it before in her work. She had watched it happen in families disputing property, in couples dividing assets, in siblings sorting through the complicated inheritance of a parent's life. She had just never expected to see it this close. She told him to take her home. He lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were swollen and red. He looked, in this moment, very young. Younger than his 38 years. He looked like the boy she had grown up beside, the boy who had been afraid of thunderstorms until he was 11 and had made her promise never to tell anyone. He began to apologize and she said his name again, quietly, and he understood and started the engine. He took her home. She did not speak on the drive back to Lekki. When the car stopped in front of her building, she opened the door, stepped out, and walked to the entrance without looking back. She heard him call her name once, softly, from the car window. She went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment. The flat was exactly as she had left it. The photographs still spread across the dining table. The cold cup of tea. The reading glasses she had left on the arm of the chair. Everything exactly the same. And yet the flat felt entirely different. The way a room feels different when you understand what has been hidden inside the walls. She walked to the table and looked at the photographs one last time. Mama at 40. Mama at 60. Mama at every age Adaeze had been present for and some ages she had only heard about. She gathered them all up, every single one, and stacked them carefully. She carried the stack to the bedroom and placed it in the wardrobe, behind the box of winter cardigans she kept for traveling to cold places. Then she went back to the kitchen and sat down in the quiet of the afternoon. What happened inside Adaeze during those hours was not something she could have easily described. From the outside it would have looked like nothing. A woman in her mid-30s sitting at a kitchen table with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance. The city outside her window. The hum of the building's generator kicking on and off. But inside something was shifting. Something large and slow and with the quality of a decision being made not by the thinking mind but by something deeper and older. For 9 months, Adaeze had been a woman submerged. She had gone to work and done her work and come home and cooked and called Emeka on Sundays and visited the grave in Enugu on public holidays and been, by every visible measure, a woman managing her grief with dignity. She had not been managing. She had been surviving. And now she understood that the thing she had been surviving was, in its largest part, a lie. The grief was real. She did not question this. Every night she had spent awake. Every time she had reached for her phone to call a dead woman. Every moment of the particular loneliness of losing a mother, which is different from every other loneliness. All of it real. All of it genuinely felt. All of it hers. But the death was not real. The bus accident was not real. The closed casket and the graveside in Enugu and the 9 months of mourning a woman who was alive and eating stockfish from Oyingbo market and holding other children at a gate while Adaeze stood in her flat in Lekki learning how to be someone whose mother was gone. None of it was real. What was real was this. A woman had looked at the daughter she had raised and decided that daughter was something to be left behind. Had decided that Adaeze, who had loved her fiercely and completely and without reservation, was a weight from which she needed to be free. Had designed a performance of death specific enough to include a closed casket and an uncle's complicity and 45,000 naira worth of polished mahogany, and had walked out of one life into another. Adaeze sat with this until she understood what she felt. Then she reached for her phone. She did not call Emeka. She did not call her friend Blessing or her colleague Tund or anyone who would meet the news with sympathy and advice and the gentle suggestion that she needed to rest. She scrolled past all of them and found the number near the bottom of her contacts. A name she had saved 2 years ago when a colleague had needed to locate a property document that had disappeared from her late father's estate. Her colleague had pressed the number into her hand and told her to keep it. You never know when you need someone who finds things. Adaeze had kept it. She had never imagined needing it. The name in her contacts read, Femi Adeyemi, Private Investigator. She stared at it for a moment. Then she pressed call. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and unhurried, the voice of someone who had long ago stopped separating weekdays from weekends because the work did not make that distinction. She introduced herself and told him a colleague had given her his number 2 years ago. She had a situation, she said, that required someone careful and discreet. Someone who found things that had been deliberately hidden. A brief pause. Not surprise. Attention. He asked what kind of situation. Adaeze looked at the empty kitchen around her. The cold tea. The flat that had been too quiet for 9 months because she had been mourning a woman who was on the other side of Lagos buying stockfish and holding someone else's grandchildren. Her mother had faked her own death, she told him. She had been living under a different name in Lagos for 9 months. She had been found that morning by accident. What was needed now was to understand exactly how it had been arranged, who had helped, and what her legal rights were in relation to everything that had been left behind. A longer pause on the other end. He could see her Monday morning, he said. She told him she could come that afternoon. A brief silence, and then he told her 3 o'clock and said he would send the address. She hung up and sat for another moment. Then she stood, went to the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been awake for more than 30 hours on top of 9 months of inadequate sleep. There were shadows under her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that had not been there a year ago. But her eyes were clear. She leaned closer. She looked at her eyes the way she had looked at the photographs the night before, with intention, with attention. Clear and steady. Good, she thought. She went to get dressed. Femi Adeyemi's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in Ikeja that looked like it had once been something grander and had settled, without complaint, into being something practical. The elevator was out of service. The stairwell was clean. The office itself was compact and organized, with 2 metal filing cabinets, a desk that held a laptop and a notepad and nothing unnecessary, and a window that looked out over a row of telecommunications masts toward the hazy mid-afternoon sky. Femi himself was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone younger, with the restless energy of a man who spent his days pursuing people through cities. Instead, he was perhaps 55, solidly built, with a calm and methodical manner and reading glasses that he kept folded on the desk in front of him. He had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades listening to people in crisis and had learned that stillness was the most useful thing he could offer them. He stood when she entered, shook her hand with a brief firm grip, and gestured to the chair across the desk. She told him everything. In order, without rushing, without breaking down. The market. The woman with the gap-toothed smile and the ruined thumb and the deliberate step. The white Sienna bus with the plate number she had memorized. The pawpaw yellow house. The man in the white caftan. The children at the gate. The all-night vigil with the photographs laid out across the dining table. Her brother's confession in the car on the Mango Tree Street. Femi listened without interrupting. He did not write anything down during the account. He simply listened with the complete, professional attention of a man who understood that what people say and what they mean are often not the same thing, and that the distance between them is usually where the truth lives. His eyes moved over her face as she spoke, not intrusively, but with the careful reading quality of someone cataloging details that others might miss. When she finished, a brief quiet settled over the room. Her uncle, he said then. Sixtus. He had arranged the documentation. The death certificate, the accident report. And the casket, the funeral home, someone had coordinated that too. When she confirmed it was most likely Uncle Sixtus, though she did not know how much the funeral home itself had known, he nodded slowly and picked up his glasses, held them, set them down. A staged death at this level, he explained, required at minimum 3 points of cooperation. Someone inside or connected to a registry office. Someone at or connected to a funeral home. Someone willing to sign the primary identification documentation. Her uncle appeared to be the center of it. The question was who he had used and how deeply each person understood what they were participating in. She asked whether he could find out. Everything left traces, he said. Always. No matter how carefully something was constructed, The construction itself required materials, and materials came from somewhere real. The more layers a thing had, the more places there were to find the joints. What he needed from her before they went any further was everything she could give him about her uncle. His habits, his connections, his history in Enugu. People he trusted. People who trusted him. The names of anyone he had done business with or favors for over the years. She had not expected this. She had expected to hand the problem over and wait. She told him so. He wanted to know who her uncle was, he said simply. Not what he had done. Who he was. The what followed from the who, in his experience. She thought about Uncle Sixtus. 68 years old. A retired local government clerk who had spent 30 years navigating the particular ecosystem of Nigerian bureaucracy with the patient expertise of a man who understood that systems were operated by people and people had needs and needs could be met. He had never been corrupt in the dramatic sense. He had simply been, for 3 decades, the kind of man who knew which door to knock on and what to bring when he knocked. She told Femi all of this. The cousin who worked in the state civil service. The old colleague from the local government who had moved to the registry office in the early 2000s. The network of small obligations and returned favors that constituted her uncle's social infrastructure. Femi listened, and this time he wrote, small precise notes in a handwriting she could not read from across the desk. The funeral home, he said when she finished. Which one had handled the burial? She told him. Resurrection Glory Funeral Services, on the Enugu Onitsha Road. She had not chosen it herself. Uncle Sixtus had recommended it, handled the arrangement, told her it was a good Christian establishment that treated the deceased with dignity. He wrote the name down and asked one more question. The accident report. Had her family ever received a copy, a reference number, a case file from the Road Safety Commission? Uncle Sixtus had handled everything, she told him. He had said it was better that way. That they should not have to deal with officials in their state of grief. She had accepted that. Most people would, Femi said. Not unkindly. Simply as a fact. It was what her uncle had been counting on. He set his pen down and looked at her directly across the desk. He wanted to be clear about something before they proceeded. This kind of investigation, when it involved a staged death and official documentation, required him to work in a particular way. He would not move fast and he would not share partial findings. Partial information in a situation like this created the temptation to act before the full picture was clear, and acting before the full picture was clear helped the people who had built the fiction, not the person trying to dismantle it. She asked how long he had been doing this work. 23 years, he said. She asked how often in 23 years, patience had produced a better result than urgency. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Every time, he said. Then she could work within those terms, she told him. He gave her his direct line and said he would call within the week with an initial assessment. He stood and walked her to the door with the unhurried courtesy of a man who understood that the person leaving his office was carrying something heavy and deserved to be seen properly on their way out. She went home and started the green notebook. Femi worked the way Adaeze imagined a good investigator worked. Without drama, without breathless calls at odd hours, without the urgency of someone performing the importance of their own work. He worked the way a careful builder works, attending to foundations before walls, checking each piece before moving to the next, never placing weight on something until he was certain it would hold. He called every 3 or 4 days. Always in the morning, always brief, always precise. She kept the green notebook open during every call and wrote down what he told her in her clear, deliberate handwriting. Names, dates, addresses. The slowly assembling shape of what had been built to make her mother disappear. The first call came on a Wednesday, 6 days after their meeting. He had located the registry clerk. His name was Osita, and he worked in the Enugu State Civil Registry Office where he had been employed for 14 years. Known in certain circles, Femi said without editorial comment, as a man whose professional services extended beyond his official job description, provided the arrangement was handled discreetly and the compensation was sufficient. He had processed documentation of questionable origin before and was not unusual in this respect within his particular professional environment. What made him relevant was that the specific type of documentation he had processed for her uncle, a death certificate with no corroborating hospital records, matched a pattern Femi had encountered in 2 previous cases. She asked if that meant he had done this before. For other clients, Femi confirmed. Her uncle was not the first person to use him for this purpose. He was simply the most recent. And men in Osita's position, once they understood the full weight of their exposure, tended to cooperate rather than resist. The second call came 4 days later. The accident report was thinner in its construction than the death certificate. It had been filed through an online portal used by the Federal Road Safety Commission for public incident reporting, using an account created 3 days before the staged accident with a name and contact details that corresponded to no real person. The phone number attached to the account was a prepaid SIM, purchased at a phone accessories shop on Oyingbo Road in Enugu. The shop had a CCTV camera above its entrance. The footage from that week was no longer on the shop's own system, but it had been backed up to an external drive as part of the owner's standard practice. Femi had, through a mutual acquaintance, obtained access to it. She asked what the footage showed. He would tell her when he had confirmed what he believed it showed, he said. 2 more days. 2 days later the call came and the footage showed Uncle Sixtus. She set her pen down on the notebook and sat with this for a moment. Not because it was surprising. She had known since her brother's confession that Uncle Sixtus was the architect. But knowing a thing and seeing it confirmed, seeing it become evidence rather than family testimony, were 2 different experiences entirely. He had bought the SIM himself, Femi said. 3 days before the staged accident. In a shop on Oyingbo Road approximately 2 kilometers from the registry office where Osita worked. That proximity was not coincidental. Her uncle had conducted his arrangements within a geography he knew, within a world he was comfortable in, because he had not expected anyone to look. The third call came a week later and concerned the funeral home. Resurrection Glory Funeral Services had processed the burial according to the documentation presented to them. The director, a man named Brother Emmanuel, had not known the death certificate was fraudulent. He had been presented with official-looking papers, a sealed casket and payment in full, and had proceeded accordingly. He was not complicit in any meaningful legal sense. But, Femi said, and she had already learned that his pauses before the word but were worth paying close attention to, the sealed casket arrangement had been specifically requested by her uncle, not suggested by the funeral home. Brother Emmanuel's intake records showed a note in his own handwriting indicating the family had requested a sealed casket for religious reasons, based on what Uncle Sixtus had told him. It was not a suggestion that arose naturally from the circumstances. It was a request made with a specific purpose. There was one more thing, Femi said. And he wanted her to hear it carefully. The casket had not been empty. A staged death with a completely empty casket carried significant risk, he explained. If at any point the casket were opened or examined, an empty casket would immediately unravel everything. Her uncle had understood this. The casket had contained remains, not a person, but remains consistent with what a funeral home would consider acceptable for a sealed casket burial under the circumstances presented. She arranged that too, Adaeze said quietly. Through Brother Emmanuel, Femi confirmed, who had had no reason to question the arrangement and every professional reason to comply with a paying family's requests. She looked at the green notebook. At the list of names and dates and facts that had been accumulating over the weeks. The list of a life carefully dismantled and rebuilt in the wrong shape. She asked Femi how long he had been building what he now had. 3 weeks and 2 days, he said. She asked if it was complete. Almost, he said. 1 more week. There were financial threads still to follow. Her uncle had been managing the Enugu property rental and he wanted a complete accounting of every naira collected before they went to her lawyer. Take the week, she told him. She closed the green notebook and sat in the quiet of her Lekki flat and thought about her uncle. 68 years old. A man who had loved his sister with the particular fierce loyalty of a younger sibling who had watched her struggle and spent his whole life wanting to be the one who made things easier for her. A man who had believed, genuinely, that what he was building was a kindness. She thought about the shop on Oyingbo Road. The prepaid SIM. The careful geography of a man who had done everything within a world he knew, because he had not expected anyone to look. She was glad she had looked. She had also spoken to a lawyer. Her name was Sola Adaeze, a woman in her late 40s who worked from a clean, efficient office in Victoria Island and who had been recommended by a partner at the firm where Adaeze worked as a paralegal. Sola was not a warm person, not in the easy social sense, but she was extraordinarily clear, and clarity was what Adaeze needed. Sola had read everything Adaeze sent her before their first meeting and arrived at it ready to speak about specifics. The death certificate was the first problem, she said, spreading the documents across her desk. It was a fraudulent document. Once that was established with Femi's evidence, the legal record of her mother's death was void. She was, in the eyes of the law, alive. Which meant the distribution of her estate had been made on the basis of a fraudulent death, and everything passed on or transferred on those grounds was legally reversible. When Adaeze raised the question of her mother's house in Enugu and the rental income Uncle Sixtus had been collecting, Sola's pen tapped against the desk once, twice, a thinking rhythm Adaeze was already learning to recognize. That income belonged legally to a living woman, she said. Her uncle had been collecting it on behalf of a fiction. There were also questions about her mother's civil service pension, which had presumably continued to be paid into an account somewhere. A pension being paid to a woman officially recorded as dead was a matter that would involve the Civil Service Board in Enugu and constituted a separate complication, but an important one. She looked at Adaeze directly across the desk and said she wanted to be clear about one thing. When this moved forward and the fraudulent death certificate was challenged in court, it would become a matter of public record. Her mother's situation would not remain private. Her uncle's role would not remain private. Her brother's role in maintaining the concealment would not remain private. She needed to be certain Adaeze had thought about that. Adaeze looked back at her steadily and thought of the grave in Enugu. The 45,000 naira casket. The 9 months of mourning a living woman. She had thought about it, she said. The days found a shape. Mornings, Adaeze made her tea and sat with the green notebook and went over what she knew and what she was waiting to find out. She had discovered in those early weeks that action, even quiet action, was the opposite of grief. Grief required nothing from her except that she receive it. This required her attention, her precision, her full presence. She slept better. Not well, but better. She had not spoken to her mother. She had thought about this carefully and decided that the time for that conversation was not yet. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from working in legal environments and watching how things unravel when they are rushed, that the conversation would matter most when she went into it knowing everything. Emeka had flown back to Abuja. He called every 2 days now. The calls were different from the ones they had exchanged over the 9 months of mourning. Those calls had been careful and considerate, the calls of two grieving adults managing the shared task of loss. These were rawer, less polished, more honest. He had contacted a lawyer of his own, as she had told him to, and his lawyer had advised him to prepare a full account of everything he knew and everything he had done. He told her it felt like dismantling a wall he had spent 6 months building brick by brick, and that this was both a relief and a terror. She told him he would be all right. He asked how she knew. Because he was cooperating, she said, and because the difference between what he had done and what Uncle Sixtus had done was the difference between a person who made a terrible choice and a person who built a machine for deception. The courts would see that difference. And because he was her brother, she added, and she was not going to let him disappear from her life as well. A long silence stretched on the line before he managed to speak. She told him not to thank her yet. To talk to his lawyer. It was Femi who called on a Tuesday morning 5 weeks into the investigation and said it was time to meet again. She should bring her lawyer. She called Sola. They met in Femi's office the following afternoon, the small tidy room on the 3rd floor, the documents spread in neat columns on his desk, his laptop open to the footage from the Ogui Road shop paused on a frame she recognized immediately. He walked them through everything with the same unhurried precision with which he had conducted the entire process. The fraudulent death certificate linked directly to Osita at the Enugu registry, the payment trail through mobile transfers, the statement from a second source who had used the same clerk 2 years earlier and was willing to confirm the method. The accident report filed on a false account using the prepaid SIM purchased on Ogui Road, the CCTV footage showing Uncle Sixtus at the moment of purchase. The sealed casket specifically requested by her uncle, documented in Brother Emmanuel's own intake records. Sola, sitting beside Adaeze with a notepad on her knee, looked up when he finished. That was sufficient, she said, more to herself than to the room. It closed the last gap. She wanted to file the challenge to the death certificate that week, she said, and move quickly before Uncle Sixtus realized what was being assembled. When Femi produced 3 pages from a folder showing a complete accounting of the rental income collected from the Enugu property across 9 months, Sola looked at them and a muscle moved in her jaw. 9 months of rental income collected by a man who knew the owner of the property was alive. That was misappropriation, she said. A separate charge from the fraud. Her uncle was in a significant amount of difficulty. There was a question then about whether Adaeze wanted to speak to her mother before the filing. Adaeze had been turning this over for days. The answer was yes, she said, but not to warn her and not to give her time to prepare a defense. She wanted to speak to her as her daughter. She wanted to look at her and hear in her own words why she had done this, before any of it became a legal document she heard about from a lawyer. Both Femi and Sola were quiet for a moment. That was her right, Sola said carefully. She only wanted her to be prepared for what that conversation would feel like. She had been preparing for it for 5 weeks, Adaeze said. She was ready. She did not call ahead. She drove to the Mango Tree Street on a Saturday morning, the same day of the week as the first time, as if the symmetry mattered, as if arriving on a Saturday were a kind of insistence on the ordinary, a refusal to let the visit be more dramatic than it needed to be. She parked in the same spot. She sat for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel and looked at the pawpaw yellow house through the windscreen. The bougainvillea was fuller than she remembered, or perhaps the light was different this morning, making it more vivid against the wall. The orange flowers in the compound were open. Somewhere inside the house she could hear music, faintly, a gospel track she did not recognize but whose tempo she felt as a kind of steadiness in the morning air. Then she got out of the car and walked to the gate and knocked. It was the man who answered. Chukwemeka Obiora came to the gate in a plain white shirt and dark trousers, the clothes of a man who dressed simply on Saturday mornings and saw no reason to apologize for it. He was taller than she had realized from the street, perhaps 6 feet, and he moved with the deliberate, unhurried ease of a man who had made peace with his age and found it acceptable. He looked at her with the polite uncertainty of a man who does not know the face at his gate but is not alarmed by not knowing it. Then something shifted in his expression, a recognition that was not about her face but about her presence, about what her presence at this gate on this morning meant. She introduced herself and told him she was there to see Chidinma. She asked him to tell her it was her daughter. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, absorbing this, understanding what he was looking at. Not just a visitor. Not just a woman at his gate on a Saturday morning. The daughter. The one he had known existed without ever having seen. Then he told her quietly to wait and walked back up the path toward the house, leaving the gate open behind him. She used the time to look at the compound properly for the first time. The low bench against the wall on the left side, worn smooth from use. A small vegetable patch in the right corner, carefully maintained, with tomato plants staked with thin sticks and what looked like uzziza growing along the edge. Her mother's garden. Her mother had always grown uzziza along the edges of things. The front door opened again and it was Chukwemeka who came back to the gate, not her mother. He stood on his side of the open gate and his expression was not what she had expected. Not discomfort. Not the careful blankness of a man managing a difficult situation. Something more direct than either of those things. Her mother was coming, he said. She needed a moment. She had been expecting this visit, he added, had been expecting it since the market. Adaeze asked if she had recognized her that day. Yes, he said. She had come home from the market and sat in that room for 3 hours without speaking. He had known her for 40 years and had seen her sit with difficult things before, but he had never seen her sit with something the way she sat with that. She had wanted to come to Adaeze herself, had been planning how to do it since she came back to Lagos. She knew she owed her that. The market was not how she had intended it to happen. But she still chose not to come, Adaeze said. She was afraid, he said simply. Not as a defense. As a fact. Of her. Of what she would think, he said. Of what she would know. Of the questions she would ask about who she had been before her. Her mother was the bravest person he knew in most respects. But there was one thing that had frightened her for 40 years, and that was the possibility of being fully known by the people she loved most and found insufficient. Adaeze looked at this man. 60 or so years old, standing at his own gate on a Saturday morning, speaking about the woman she had spent 9 months mourning with the particular unguarded honesty of someone who has loved a person long enough to have given up the performance of that love. She said she understood he had known her mother since she was 22. He confirmed it. She had left him. He nodded. She left, he said, and she built a life and raised her children and was not pretending with any of it. Her mother did not pretend. That was perhaps the thing that had made all of this so complicated. She had loved her father. She had loved the life in Enugu. And she had also loved him. And she had not known for 40 years how to hold all of those things at once without one of them breaking. So she had broken them instead, Adaeze said. Yes, he said. And she knew that. And she would carry it. She had already started and it was heavier than she had expected. He stepped aside from the gate. She was ready, he said. Adaeze walked through the gate and up the path. Chukwuemeka walked beside her and she noticed that he did not fill the silence with reassurance or comfort or any of the things that people fill silences with when they are nervous. He simply walked beside her and let the morning be what it was. She thought that this quality, the willingness to let things be what they were without decorating them, was probably one of the reasons her mother had loved him for 40 years. He opened the front door and gestured inside, then told her he would be in the back and to take whatever time was needed. He walked away through the house, past the front room, through a corridor and out of sight, giving them the space with the same quiet deliberateness with which he had spoken at the gate. A man who understood without being told where his presence was useful and where it was not. Her mother was in the front room. She was wearing a house wrapper, blue with small white flowers, and her hair was wrapped in a head tie tied loosely the way she always tied it at home on Saturday mornings, the way she had tied it every Saturday morning of Adaeze's entire childhood. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at her daughter, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Chidinma stepped aside and gestured toward the chair nearest her, and Adaeze came inside and sat down. It was a comfortable room, lived in and settled, with good chairs and a small table and photographs on the wall that Adaeze examined with the same attention she had been giving to everything for 5 weeks. The children in the photographs were adults, 2 of them, somewhere in their 30s, and there was one she recognized after a moment as the man in the white kaftan, younger, perhaps 35, standing beside a woman who was unmistakably, undeniably, her mother. Chidinma did not offer explanation immediately. She sat in the chair across from her daughter and looked at her, really looked, in the way she had always looked at Adaeze, with the complete unhurried attention that had been one of the things Adaeze had loved most fiercely about her and had missed most savagely over the 9 months. She said Adaeze had found her. Adaeze said she had. She asked how. The market, Adaeze told her. 3 weeks ago. The left foot landing heavier than the right. The ankle injury from 1987. Something moved across her mother's face, quiet and complex, and then Chidinma said that when Adaeze had called out that day before she turned, she had nearly said her name. Adaeze looked at her. She had prepared for this conversation. She had rehearsed versions of it in her mind on the long nights of the past 5 weeks. She had imagined her own anger and her own grief and her own questions laid out in order, the way she laid out documents at work. Logical. Sequential. Building toward a conclusion. Sitting here now, in this comfortable room in the pawpaw yellow house, looking at her mother's face for the first time in 9 months, none of the rehearsal was available to her. What was available was simpler and much harder. Why, she said. Just that one word. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she began to speak, not all of it at once, not the full story Emeka had pieced together from months of secret phone calls, but something more personal and more direct. The story of a woman who had spent her whole adult life carrying 2 versions of herself and had, at 63 years old, found that she could no longer carry both. She spoke about the years in Lagos before Enugu. About the man in the white kaftan who was not a secret or a shame but was, in a way that she had spent 40 years trying not to know, the person she had been most fully herself with. About the choice she had made at 24 and the years she had spent living inside the consequences of it. About Bartholomew, Adaeze's father, who had been a good man and whom she had loved sincerely and adequately but never completely. About the particular exhaustion, she called it exhaustion, and Adaeze heard inside that word decades of weight, of being someone whose truest self had nowhere to go. She spoke about Chukwuemeka's letter. The 3 months she had sat with it. The moment she had understood she was going to reply and that replying would start something she would not be able to stop. She spoke about being afraid. Afraid of what Adaeze would think. Afraid of the questions about who she had been before Enugu. Afraid that the truth of her would undo the love. So she chose a different kind of undoing, Adaeze said. Her mother looked at her hands. She had chosen what seemed, at the time, like the most merciful option. For whom, Adaeze asked. Her voice was not raised. It was very steady and very clear. Because from where she had been sitting for 9 months, there had been nothing merciful about the 45,000 naira casket or the grave in Enugu or the 9 months of learning how to live in a world she had believed did not contain her anymore. Her mother's eyes filled. She had been afraid, Chidinma said. Simply that. Adaeze sat with the answer and chose her next words with care. She knew her mother had been afraid. She understood that. But she was her daughter. She had been her daughter for 34 years. She could have come to her and told her the truth, and it would have been hard, and it would have taken time, and there would have been anger and hurt on both sides. But she would have still been her daughter on the other side of it. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the compound, children's voices rose and then settled as Chukwuemeka redirected them gently away from the front room window. He knew, Adaeze thought, to give them this space. He knew the shape of what was happening in here. She told her mother then about the legal proceedings. The death certificate was fraudulent. The documentation Uncle Sixtus had arranged could be traced. There was a lawyer and an investigator, and the evidence was complete. She wanted her mother to know that before it became something she heard about from a court document. She wanted her to hear it from her. Chidinma absorbed this. Her face did not collapse. She had, Adaeze thought, been expecting something like this. Perhaps since the market. Perhaps longer. She said she understood. When Adaeze added that Uncle Sixtus would face consequences, and possibly Emeka too, depending on how his involvement was treated, and that she had already told Emeka to get a good lawyer and cooperate fully, Chidinma nodded slowly. They sat in silence for a moment. Not comfortable silence and not hostile silence. The particular silence of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are both looking at what is on the other side. Her mother said her name. Adaeze looked at her. She loved her, Chidinma said. She had always loved her. Nothing about what she had done changed that. Adaeze told her she knew. And she did know it. This was perhaps the most complicated part. The love had been real and present and consistent across 34 years, and it had not been enough to make her mother stay, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and the truth of each did not cancel the other, and she was going to have to learn to hold both of them for a long time. She stood and picked up her bag. She told her mother to get a good lawyer and tell them the truth from the beginning. At the doorway she stopped. Her mother was standing in the middle of the room with her house wrapper and her loosely tied head tie and her gap-toothed face and the scar above her right eyebrow and the ruined thumb visible at her side. Every detail that Adaeze had memorized across 34 years of knowing her. Every detail that had made her certain in a market aisle 3 weeks ago against all reason and all grief. She looked like herself. Entirely, undeniably herself. She said she was sorry. Truly sorry. Adaeze looked at her mother for a long moment. She knew that too, she said. Then she walked out of the pawpaw yellow house and through the garden and out of the gate and into the bright Saturday morning. Chukwuemeka had come to the gate to see her out. He did not say much. He stood at the open gate and looked at her with the expression of a man who understood that what had just happened in the front room of his house was significant in ways that would take a long time to fully understand. She thanked him for speaking to her honestly at the gate before she went in. He nodded once and said her mother deserved to be known, all of her, not just the parts she had chosen to show. He believed, he said, that Adaeze was the person who could know all of her. He had believed that since her mother first told him about her. She asked if her mother had talked about her. For years, he said. Long before she came back to Lagos. Her name was always in their conversations. Her work. Her independence. The way she handled things. Her mother had been proud of her for a very long time. She had been afraid of her, he said, for exactly the same reason. She sat with us in the car on the drive back to Lekki. The fear and the pride. The same source for both. She understood this more than she wanted to admit. She had inherited it. The legal proceedings took 3 months. Sola Adebayo had warned her they would take longer and had been pleasantly wrong, partly because the evidence Femi had assembled was so complete that the defense found very little solid ground, and partly because Uncle Sixtus, when confronted with the full weight of what was in front of him, had instructed his lawyer to cooperate with the court rather than contest everything. Adaeze attended every hearing. The courtroom was not a dramatic place. It was a functional room in the Lagos High Court with cream-painted walls and wooden benches and an air conditioning unit on the wall above the judge's bench that worked intermittently and made a sound like a complaint when it did. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, Justice Nkechi Obi, with closely cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the particular contained authority of someone who has spent decades in rooms where people try to present partial truths as complete ones and has long since developed an accurate internal instrument for detecting the difference. Adaeze sat in the courtroom with her back straight and the green notebook on her knee and watched the legal process do the slow, unglamorous work of dismantling a carefully built lie. She had expected something more cinematic on the first day, some version of justice that arrived with a force proportional to the harm done. What she found instead was something quieter and more thorough than cinema. Documents presented. Witnesses examined. Arguments made and countered. The machinery of law moving at the speed of law, which is the speed of getting things right rather than the speed of satisfying an audience. Sola was formidable in the courtroom. Not theatrical. Formidable in the way that very well prepared, very clear-minded people are formidable, which is to say completely. She presented Femi's findings with a precision that gave the defense nothing to hold on to. The registry clerk Osita had been interviewed under caution and had provided a statement confirming the arrangement with Uncle Sixtus. The CCTV footage from the Ogui Road shop had been authenticated and entered into evidence. The mobile transfer records connecting Uncle Sixtus to Osita had been produced by the relevant network provider under court order. Each piece of evidence was presented without drama and received without visible emotion by Justice Nkechi Obi, who made notes in her own hand at intervals and asked precise, unhurried questions that told Adaeze she had read everything submitted to her with the full attention of a woman who took her work seriously. Uncle Sixtus attended every hearing. He sat at the defendant's table in his good agbada, the one he wore to church, and he looked older than he had at the funeral 9 months ago. Not physically, not dramatically, but in the particular way that a person ages when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and the carrying has become visible in their face. He did not look at Adaeze across the courtroom. On the third day of the hearing she caught him glancing at her once, briefly, and what she saw in the glance was not defiance and not calculation but something much simpler and harder to name. The look of a man who loves the person he has harmed and has no way to make that love and that harm occupy the same sentence coherently. She looked back at him steadily and then looked away. His lawyer, a careful man from Enugu who had clearly advised his client thoroughly on the benefits of cooperation, made no attempt to contest the evidence of what had been done. What he contested, with measured eloquence, was the interpretation. The intent had been protective rather than malicious. Uncle Sixtus had acted out of love for a sister, had believed genuinely that he was sparing his family unnecessary pain, had not profited personally from the arrangement beyond the rental income which he had maintained in a separate account with the full intention of returning it to its rightful owner. Sola in her response did not argue with the love. She argued with the consequence. A man who commits fraud out of love is still a man who commits fraud. A family that is deceived gently is still a family that is deceived. A daughter who mourns a living mother for 9 months has still lost 9 months. And no interpretation of the deceiver's intentions restores what was lost. Justice Nkechi Obi listened to both arguments with equal attention. She made notes. She called a recess for lunch and returned in the afternoon and asked questions that Adaeze, reading them carefully, understood were not really questions at all but the judge organizing her conclusions into the shape of language. The hearing on the fraudulent death certificate was the one Adaeze found hardest to sit through. Not because of what was said but because of what was shown. When Sola presented the certificate itself, enlarged on a display board with annotations indicating the points of fabrication, Adaeze looked at it and felt something that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings and everything to do with the specific Tuesday morning 9 months ago when Uncle Sixtus had pressed a copy of that document into her hands at the family house in Enugu and she had held it. And wept over it and folded it carefully and placed it in the folder with the other documents of her mother's death. She had wept over a fabricated document. She had organized her grief around a piece of paper that a man named Osita had produced for a negotiated fee. She wrote in the green notebook, "The certificate is on the board. It is smaller than I remembered. The font is ordinary. The official stamp is in the bottom right corner. It looks exactly like what it was designed to look like." She underlined the last sentence and moved on. Emeka flew down from Abuja for every hearing without being asked. He sat beside her on the courtroom bench, his shoulder occasionally touching hers in the crowded space, and he did not try to fill the hours with words. He brought her water on the long afternoons and held her coat when she took it off and was, in these small and consistent ways, exactly the brother she had needed him to be 9 months earlier and was grateful, without saying it, to have him being now. On the day that Sola presented the full accounting of the rental income collected by Uncle Sixtus from the Enugu property, Emeka leaned slightly toward her and she felt him tense when the figure was stated aloud. Neither of them spoke. They both looked at the front of the room and let the number sit in the air and mean what it meant. Walking out of the courtroom into the late afternoon heat of Lagos after that hearing, Emeka said quietly that he wanted to give back his share of the estate. The businesses, what their father had left. It had never been clean and he wanted it to be clean. Whatever it took. Adaeze looked at her brother for a long moment and told him to talk to his lawyer first and then to her. No, she said. Just do it properly. No more arrangements between siblings that bypass the proper process. They had both seen where that led. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. She sounded like Mama, he said. She knew, she told him. And she did know, had known it for years, had perhaps always known that the part of her mother she had inherited most completely was the part that insisted on doing things right even when doing them right was harder than the available alternative. They walked to the car park together in the Lagos afternoon and she did not feel, walking beside him, the cold clarity of the past few months. She felt something warmer and more complicated. The ongoing work of loving a person who has failed you. The particular effort of that. The choice it required, made not once but continuously, every day, in the small unremarkable moments where it would be easier to close the door and simpler to stay closed. She made the choice. She kept walking. He walked beside her. The sentencing came on a Thursday morning in the 3rd month. Uncle Sixtus received a suspended sentence of 2 years and a fine representing the full amount of the rental income collected, plus interest assessed by the court. Given his age, his cooperation, the absence of personal financial enrichment beyond the rental matter, and what Justice Nkechi Obi described in her sentencing remarks as a genuine if profoundly misguided motivation of familial protection, she did not impose a custodial sentence. She did, however, spend 7 minutes of her remarks addressing the harm done. Adaeze sat in the courtroom and listened to Justice Nkechi Obi describe the 9 months of her life with a precision and a seriousness that made her grip the green notebook very tightly. The judge spoke about the particular nature of grief that is built on falsehood. She spoke about the impossibility of mourning honestly when the foundation of the mourning is a lie. She spoke about the cost that is borne by the deceived, not merely the financial cost, not merely the legal cost, but the cost that does not appear in any court document. The cost of a daughter's trust in the people who were supposed to be her protection. Adaeze did not cry. She had thought she might, in the days leading up to sentencing, had imagined the possibility and not been certain how she felt about it. But sitting there and hearing those words from a woman in judicial robes who had spent 3 months reading the architecture of what had been done to her, she did not cry. She felt instead the particular satisfaction of being seen accurately. Of having the truth of her experience named correctly by someone with the authority to name it in a place where the naming meant something. She wrote in the green notebook, Justice Obi said, the cost of a daughter's trust. Thursday, 11:42 a.m. Then she closed the notebook and sat quietly until the proceedings concluded. Emeka's situation was handled carefully. His lawyer had done good work. His cooperation with the investigation, combined with Adaeze's own statement that her brother had confessed fully and voluntarily without being compelled, resulted in a conditional discharge. He would not serve time. He would spend 2 years under supervision with significant community service obligations in Abuja. He called her the evening after sentencing, his voice very quiet. She told him she knew. He said he did not know how to begin. She told him he would figure it out. He had time. He asked if she was still angry with him and she thought about it honestly before answering. Yes, she said. She was still angry. But she was also his sister and those two things were both true and neither was going away and they were going to have to learn to live with both of them, just as he was going to have to live with what he had done and with what he would do now with the years ahead of him. A long silence settled on the line and then he said he loved her and she said she loved him too and told him to get some sleep. He had community service at 7 in the morning. He laughed. It was a raw, surprised, genuine laugh. The first she had heard from him in 9 months. She went to sleep that night earlier than she had since before the market and slept without waking until morning. 3 months after the hearings concluded, Adaeze applied for a transfer within her firm to the Lagos head office. She had been working in a satellite capacity for 2 years, managing her caseload remotely with occasional visits to the main office. She had resisted the full transfer before because moving to Lagos had felt, while she was in the middle of grief, like too large a change to make while managing a life already disrupted by loss. She had wanted the stability of the familiar. The same flat. The same routines. The same geography. She understood now that she had been using stability as another word for staying still. She submitted the transfer application on a Tuesday morning, which had become, without her planning it, the day she did significant things. She had called Emeka on a Tuesday. She had called Femi on a Tuesday. She had walked into the pawpaw yellow house for the first time on a Tuesday. Tuesdays had a particular quality in her life now, the quality of a day on which she moved forward regardless of how she felt about moving. The transfer was approved within a month. She also enrolled in a community mediation training program. 3 evenings a week at a community hall in Surulere, learning the formal structures of what she had been doing instinctively since childhood. Understanding conflict. Listening for the real thing beneath the presented thing. Finding the place where something genuine could be built from the ruins of something that had collapsed. She was good at it in a way that was immediately apparent to the trainer, a compact no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Afolabi who had been doing community mediation in Lagos for 25 years and had the particular gift of recognizing the people who had come to learn because they already knew how to do the thing and simply needed the language for it. After the 3rd session, Mrs. Afolabi told her she had done this before, not as a question, and she said in a manner of speaking. Mrs. Afolabi looked at her with the assessing directness of a woman who had spent a quarter-century reading people in conflict and said that whatever manner of speaking it was, she should use it. It was the real thing. She called Emeka every Sunday. The calls evolved over the weeks and months in the particular way that honest relationships evolve when the people in them are committed to the honesty more than the comfort. There were Sundays when the conversation was warm and ordinary and they talked about his community service and her mediation training and the small events of their separate lives, and she felt during those calls the specific pleasure of being known by someone who has seen you at your worst and chosen to keep knowing you. There were other Sundays when the conversation was harder, when she said something that needed to be said and he received it in silence and she waited and he found a response that was honest rather than defensive, and they both moved forward with the slightly raw and slightly cleaner feeling of two people who have chosen truth over smoothness. She visited the pawpaw yellow house once a month. The visits had developed their own texture. The first few had been formal in the way that important things are formal when they are new, everyone present and aware of the significance of the room they were in together. Chidinma careful. Adaeze careful. Chukwuemeka present in the background in the particular way he had established from the beginning, available without imposing, warm without requiring warmth in return. By the 3rd visit, Adaeze had begun to understand Chukwuemeka properly. He was a man who had built a life around a love that was intermittent and complicated and returned to him in portions rather than completely. He had spent 40 years with a woman who belonged also to other people and other places, and he had learned, out of necessity and then out of genuine disposition, how to hold love lightly. How to receive what was given without demanding more than the giving. How to be steady in a situation that was structurally unsteady. She thought about this quality, the holding lightly. She was not sure she had ever truly possessed it. She had held things tightly her entire adult life. Her work. Her friendships. Her grief. Everything clenched, everything held firmly in place as though the holding itself were what kept things real. On the 4th visit she stayed for lunch. It was not planned. Chidinma had been cooking when she arrived and the smell of the food had been, without warning, devastating. Egusi soup with stockfish, the smell of her entire childhood distilled into one Saturday afternoon kitchen, and Adaeze had stood in the doorway and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the market. Since before the market. Since long before. Her mother looked at her from the stove and said sit down in the voice that had always meant sit down, and Adaeze sat down. They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, because Chukwuemeka was there and there was no reasonable way to exclude him and no part of Adaeze that actually wanted to. He ate with the appetite of a man who genuinely enjoyed food and was not embarrassed about it, and he told a story about his son Toby, who had apparently attempted to install a ceiling fan in his Port Harcourt flat without professional assistance and had produced a result that required a professional to come and address both the fan and the consequential damage to the ceiling. Chidinma laughed, really laughed, and Adaeze found herself laughing too before she had decided to, before she had considered whether laughing was appropriate, in the involuntary and slightly helpless way that real laughter arrives. She looked at her mother laughing across the kitchen table. She looked at this woman she had buried and mourned and found and confronted and was still, slowly and imperfectly and without a clear map, in the process of knowing again. She looked at the gap-toothed smile and the scar above the eyebrow and the ruined thumb around a soup spoon, and she felt the thing she had been circling around for months arrive without ceremony. She was glad her mother was alive. Not glad in the complicated, conditional way she had been feeling it since the market. Simply glad. With the uncomplicated gladness of a daughter who has her mother at a kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon and knows, in a way she had not known for 9 months, that this is something and not nothing. She did not say it. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be said in the moment of feeling it. She stored it in the place where true things are stored and moved forward. On the drive home that afternoon she called Emeka. He asked how she was and she told him she had had lunch at Mama's. A long pause settled on the line before he asked carefully how it was. The Adaeze was correct, she told him. She heard him exhale. Heard the smile in the exhale. Her Adaeze was always correct, he said. Adaeze said. Her Adaeze is always correct. Another pause, longer this time, and then he said it too. She drove through the Lagos afternoon with the phone between her shoulder and her ear and the city doing its Saturday thing around her, loud and indifferent and completely alive, and she thought about the grave in Enugu and the pawpaw yellow house and the mango tree street and the 45,000 naira casket and the 9 months and what they had cost her and what they had, despite everything, given her. She did not think the giving justified the cost. She had decided early on that she was not going to tell herself that story. Suffering was not a gift. Deception was not a curriculum. The 9 months had happened to her and they had changed her, and some of the changes were things she valued, and none of that made the 9 months acceptable. But she was here. She was on the other side of it, and she was upright and moving, and the moving was her own. That was not nothing. That was, she had come to understand, quite a great deal. On a Saturday in March, almost exactly 1 year after the Oyingbo market and the shattered everything, Adaeze drove to Enugu. She visited the grave. The headstone was still there. The name. The dates. The death date that was wrong on every level a date could be wrong. Someone had put fresh flowers, purple ones, the kind her mother had always grown, along the compound wall. She stood in front of the headstone for a long time in the warm March morning and said nothing and thought a great deal. She thought about the girl she had been at 7 years old, screaming when the cooking pot fell from the shelf, running to find her mother on the kitchen floor laughing through the pain. She thought about every Saturday market with Mama's hand on her shoulder guiding her through the stalls, teaching her how to read the quality of tomatoes and how to negotiate without embarrassing yourself and how to walk through a crowd as though you belonged in it. She thought about 9 months of mornings without that hand on her shoulder. She thought about a pawpaw yellow house and a kitchen table and Adaeze soup and a gap-toothed laugh arriving before she had decided to allow it. She crouched down and placed her palm flat against the base of the headstone. The stone was warm from the morning sun. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she stood up. She stood up and straightened her clothes and looked at the name on the stone one last time and felt, as clearly and as quietly as she had felt anything in her life, that she was finished here. Not finished with her mother. Not finished with the work of knowing her and understanding her and holding the full complicated truth of her. But finished with the grief that had been built on a false foundation. Finished with mourning. Ready, instead, to live with whatever was actually true. She walked back to her car in the March morning. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windscreen she could see the rows of headstones in the soft morning light, each one marking the place where a true loss had occurred, where someone was genuinely gone and genuinely missed, and she felt for all of them, the genuine mourners, the real absences, a respect that was different from what she had felt standing at this same grave 9 months ago. She had thought she was one of them. She had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost her, and she was grateful now, in a way she was still learning how to carry, that the cost had not been larger. She started the engine. She drove back to Lagos through the brightening morning, through the familiar landscape of the road that connected the two cities she had always moved between, and she thought about the mediation session on Monday evening and the transfer that had brought her fully to the Lagos office and the visit she had scheduled for the following Saturday at the pawpaw yellow house. She thought about Emeka and his Sunday calls and his community service and the slow daily work of becoming better than you have been. She thought about all of it and let it be what it was. When she turned into her street in Lekki and saw her building at the end of it, the familiar facade, the small tree by the entrance that had grown noticeably in the 2 years she had lived there, she felt the thing she had been working toward since the market arrived without announcement. Home. Not a place she was surviving in. Not a place she had retreated to from a world that had broken open. Simply home. Hers. The life inside it hers. The morning ahead hers. The woman who climbed out of the car and locked it and walked to the entrance hers. She went inside and made herself a proper breakfast. She sat at the table in the morning light and ate all of it and looked at the empty space where the green notebook had been and felt no need to fill it immediately. The green notebook was finished. It had done what it needed to do. There would be another notebook when another notebook was needed. For now there was just the breakfast and the light and the day opening in front of her without condition. She finished eating. She washed the plate. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked at the building opposite and the slice of sky above it, bright and clear and entirely ordinary. Then she went to get ready for the day. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Please like, share, and comment on the lessons you have taken from Adaeze's journey. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one.